Good evening. Happy Thursday or something. Here we are again. 5 o'clock. Time for another reading of The Demon in the Embers, the fourth book in the Scargatherer series. I've been fiddling slightly again with the phone. I bought a case for this one after the last one got smashed. I've never had a case. I've had a mobile phone for years, and I've never had a case because I've never smashed one until last week. Well, earlier this week. So here we are. So yeah, I've slightly fiddled around with it, so I hope it's okay. I'm back in the blanket today because it's got a bit chilly, hasn't it? It really has. So we're here for another chapter. Quick announcement while you're here. Tomorrow I suddenly realised I've got an appointment at 4 o'clock in town in Salisbury, which is where I live. And so I might not be back by 5, so I'm going to do it at 5:30 tomorrow. And I'll mention that at the end again, just in case people come in the middle and haven't noticed. So 5:30 tomorrow. But today we're here for chapter 4. Where is it? When I put the title in for the thing, I put a title in, so you say start new post, go live, and I always put what the chapter is and then the book. So chapter 4, The Demon in the Embers. And once you've put the title in a few times, it starts to offer you the right words for predictive texting. Only this time it seems to be offering me, instead of the word embers, it offers me the word dog. The Demon in the Dog? Is that a book I haven't heard of, or a film I haven't heard of? I don't know. I did wonder. Okay, we are on chapter 4. Oh yes, so Joe is at Lucy's house. Joe's father has gone off back to work. He's a silk merchant, a mercer, silk merchant, and his apprentice is Tobias, who's a distant cousin of Lucy's, and very surly and unhappy. He's also a Puritan, like Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan, so probably top Puritan, basically. Puritans believed in not having any fun. They thought religion should be very, very pure and unornamented, and people shouldn't wear fancy clothes at all or have particularly fancy food or anything. As far as they were concerned, life ought to be really austere, cut back to the bone. And so for Tobias to be apprenticed to the Mercers is really bad news, because of course the Mercers, they're silk merchants. Silk is a luxury fabric. What else? So he really doesn't like it. Joe doesn't want an apprenticeship, of course, because he doesn't know how long he's going to stay, but he does want to be allowed to stay. And he's just been talking to Lucy and her mother about the experience of the Great Plague for the family, when Matthew, Cess, and Anne all died, and little Francis, and there was another baby, it turns out, baby Thomas, and he died of starvation because the family was shut up and didn't have enough to eat, because that's how that was the quarantine measures London tried to use to control the plague in 1665. So Joe has this in his mind. Chapter 4. For a while, Lucy and her mother worked at their tasks. Joe watched them, wishing there was something he could do. He felt uneasy sitting idle while they were busy. Presently, Lucy looked up from her sewing and said, "I've been thinking. If my father is able to arrange something for Joe, he'll probably start tomorrow. After that he won't have much free time. Could I take him out this afternoon and show him around the city?" Her mother looked doubtful. "Your father thought Joe probably shouldn't go out again after what happened earlier. If those men caught him a second time, even the two of you together wouldn't be able to save him from being pressed." "Don't you think he might be safer if we dressed him up a bit? His clothes look rather worn out. If we put him in some of Peter's old best clothes, he'd look quite a bit richer. Then if we do see the men, they might not dare approach him." Ellen considered this. "You may be right. Let's see what we can find." Joe followed Lucy and her mother out into the hallway and up the stairs. It seemed to be quite a big house, he thought. Downstairs there were the dining and sitting rooms, and then at the back the kitchen, and another door opposite. Up here, oddly, There were 5 doors rather than 4, as well as a second staircase to the attics. "That's the House of Office in there," Lucy whispered, pulling open a door that Ellen had passed. Behind it was a tiny space with a narrow wooden box just lower than waist height. On the floor beside it was a pile of little booklets printed with text. The top one seemed to have had several thin pages torn off the front. "You know, the clothes stool, if you need to..." Lucy looked meaningfully at Joe. "Oh, yeah." He pretended to understand. Then it dawned on him. The House of Office must be the toilet. The box was the loo, and the booklets were being used as the loo roll. Ellen led the way into one of the bedrooms at the front of the house. Like the bedchambers at Old Wardour, it had a 4-poster bed with heavy curtains all around it, though this time the bed had a kind of domed roof made from crimson material, like the curtains. There was a sprout of crimson feathers at the pinnacle. Curtains hung at the windows too, where at Wardour there had been shutters, and a rug was spread across the floor. Wall hangings covered the 2 side walls, in front of which stood a cabinet and a large chest of drawers. "Right, let's have a look." Ellen opened one drawer and then another. "Ah, yes, here we are." She handed Lucy a shirt with a frill all the way down the front, and then 2 long pieces of lace. Next she lifted out a dark blue velvet jacket and a matching pair of breeches, like a smarter version of the ones Joe was wearing. "You'll need fresh stockings as well," she said, "and there are some galoshios to go with the coat and breeches. It's silly, really, to have kept it all. I just couldn't bear to pass it on yet." Lucy put her hand on her mother's shoulder. "You might have another child," she said. Ellen shook her head. "It took 4 years for Frances to come along after Anne, and another 4 for baby Thomas. I'm not as young as I was. I shall have to content myself with you and Peter." Joe's heart ached to hear the sadness in her voice. His own mother might only have him and Sam, but that had been her choice. She hadn't had 5 other children who'd died. Ellen handed the coat and breeches to Joe and burrowed in the drawer again. "Take these, Lucy." She held out a pair of white stockings and some shoes of midnight blue brocade. "You can help Joe get changed in your chamber." Joe followed Lucy into the room next door. Like the first bedroom, it looked out over the street, or to be more accurate, straight into the front bedroom of the house opposite. It was smaller, having had the closet partitioned off, but it was still about the same size as Joe's room at home. It was similarly decorated to the room they had just been in, except that a circular mirror in a gold frame hung over the fireplace on the back wall. "We're very fortunate," Lucy said. "My father brings all sorts of beautiful things back from Antwerp." She saw him looking at the mirror. "That was my birthday present earlier this year." She put down the shoes and laid out the stockings and shirt on her own 4-poster bed. Then she took the other clothes from Joe and spread them out too. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him expectantly. Joe blushed. She was waiting for him to undress. He bent to take off his shoes, hoping there weren't any tricky fastenings on anything he was wearing. Last time Lucy had helped him with his clothes. But by then she'd known already that he didn't come from her world. This time he had to try not to give himself away. The shoes came untied easily enough, and he undid the garters at the top of his stockings without difficulty, before removing his coat. When he began trying to unfasten the shirt, however, Lucy asked, "Aren't you going to take off the falling bands first?" Joe's fingers stopped moving. What were falling bands? He followed her gaze. She was looking at his throat. She must mean the strips of material that had hung over the front of his coat. He fumbled at the back of his neck. "Here, let me help you." She stepped round behind him and deftly untied the tapes. Joe unlaced the neck of the shirt. Suddenly he remembered his St. Christopher. He peeped inside his shirt as he took it off, wondering how to keep the pendant hidden. But beneath the shirt was a linen undershirt, It seemed ridiculous to be wearing what amounted to a long-sleeved vest in such hot weather, but it was clearly the way things were done here. Looking at the clothes Lucy had laid out on the bed, he judged he was meant to keep the undershirt on. That was good. The St. Christopher could stay tucked away out of sight. Blushing again, he unbuttoned his breeches, hoping that the undershirt was long enough to keep him decent. To his relief, however, he found that, unlike Tudor times, he was wearing long linen undershorts. "Here you are, then." Lucy held out Peter's shirt. Joe slipped it over his head and looked down at the frill. "You do up the ties on the inside." He watched him for about half a minute as he struggled with the strings, then said, "Shall I help you?" "Yes, please." Joe gave a rueful grin. "I'm not used to these things," he said truthfully. Lucy laughed. "It's much easier than what I wear." In seconds she had fastened the shirt and tied the new lace falling bands. She handed him the breeches, which buttoned up the waist like the pair he had taken off. "Are there points or something to fix the shirt to the breeches?" he asked. "Points?" Lucy put her head on one side. "I don't think so. You just tuck the shirt in loosely." Joe felt annoyed with himself. He'd been trying to be too clever. Perhaps they didn't use points at all now. From the words they used, it was obviously coat and breeches here, rather than doublet and hose. He picked up the stockings. They were fine and smooth and spotlessly white. "They're silk," Lucy said. "They're lovely, aren't they? We keep those for best, so they haven't been worn much, even though they belonged to Peter, and before that to Matthew." She sighed. As Joe put them on and tied the garters again, he thought about Lucy's eldest brother. In the last world, Matthew had died after a hunting accident. As far as Joe had been able to work out when he got home, it had been blood poisoning that had killed him. But in this world he'd died of the plague. More confusingly, Lucy's little brother Francis also seemed to have died of the plague last year. That puzzled Joe. Francis had been dead 2 years when Joe first met Lucy at Fishbourne last summer, so he should have died 3 years ago, not last year. Yet from what Ellen said, he'd still been 4 years old when he died. Joe felt a sudden pang of guilt. Here he was, trying to work out a time-slip rule to explain Francis's death, forgetting that it must have been awful for Lucy. He turned his mind to the other question that had been nagging him. He was sure he should know what year it was. He was in no doubt now that last year's plague must have been the Great Plague. They'd learned a bit about it at school a couple of years ago. There had been a village that had cut itself off after the plague was brought to them on cloth from a London tailor, but he couldn't remember for the life of him what year that was. Lucy was still silent as he put the shoes and coat on. "Is this right?" he asked when he'd done the coat up. "It seems quite short." He plucked at the expanse of shirt showing beneath it. This was how his other clothes had fitted, but he couldn't quite believe they were supposed to be like that. "You look very fine," Lucy smiled. "Are the galoshes all right? Not too big?" Joe followed her gaze down to the shoes. They had heels, but no backs, like a woman might wear in his world if she was going somewhere smart for the evening. "I think I'll manage," he grinned, hoping he'd be able to walk on the cobbles in them. "All you need is an elegant hat, and you'll look quite the young gentleman, although your hair is rather short. Is that how they wear it in Norwich?" She looked abruptly worried. "You're not a Roundhead, are you?" "No." Joe wondered whether to make up a story about cutting his hair to keep the plague away, but thought better of it. "I've always had it like this," he said. They went back downstairs together. My, exclaimed Ellen as he entered the room. "What a transformation!" "Lucy was right. I'm sure you'll be safe from the pressmen looking like that. They won't dare come near you. Lucy, fetch Peter's hat that he wears for church. That should finish off the outfit nicely." Joe took it from her and put it on. It was black, with a wide brim and a ruffle of ribbons on the hat band. perfect," Lucy cried. "You must still take care while you're out," her mother said, "and I want you back by 6. Did you not want to get changed as well, Lucy? Mary has probably finished with the dinner to help you." Lucy untied her apron and inspected herself. The grey bodice had full sleeves to just below the elbows, but it was stiff-looking where it came down to a point at the front. Below it there was a band of silvery lace down the middle of the red skirt. All of it looked to Jo like it was made of silk. This must be the advantage of being a mercer's daughter, having beautiful material for clothes. Even so, it didn't look very comfortable. "My Sunday petticoat and bodice are the same colour," Lucy explained, "but it'll take ages to unlace this one and lace up the other. The chemise looks clean enough, doesn't it?" She examined the frills of her shirt, which were showing below the sleeves of the bodice, and craned her neck down to look at the shoulders and collar. "It's fine," said Ellen. "Then I'll just change my coif." Lucy went to the mirror on the wall and unpinned her white cap. Beneath it, her hair was wound up into a bun on the back of her head, with ringlets at the front. From a drawer in the table she took out a larger white head covering and draped it over her hair, tying it beneath her chin. It was just a looser version of what she'd taken off, as far as Jo could tell. Seeing his expression as she turned round, Lucy said, "Don't you think this hood is prettier?" "I suppose so," Jo said. He didn't feel that he was the right person to judge fashion in Lucy's world. "You look very nice," he added, and then blushed furiously. Lucy blushed too, and picked up a pair of white gloves from the drawer. She eased her hands into them. They buttoned up nearly to her elbows. "Back by 6, then," Ellen reminded them. "Yes, madam." Lucy curtsied to her mother, slipped on a pair of outer shoes in the hallway, and led Jo out of the house. "What fun!" she said, clapping her hands as soon as they were out on the street. "I'm hardly ever allowed to go out now, except when I go shopping with my mother or we all go to church." "Why not?" Jo sprang back as the carriage clattered past. A gang of small boys trotted after it, throwing stones. It was hard to see why you would bother travelling like that through the city, he thought. None of the carriages he'd seen had gone any faster than walking pace, but perhaps the idea was to be noticed. "There's nobody I can go with any more," Lucy said. "I used to be allowed to run errands with Cecily or one of our other maids, but Elizabeth is too young and Mary's too busy." "What about Peter?" "He's at St. Paul's School every day except Sunday. Apart from dinner, he's out from 6 in the morning until nearly 6 at night." "Don't you go to school?" Jo asked, as they set off along the street. Lucy looked sideways at him. He realised this was one of those questions he shouldn't have asked. "We may seem rich to you," she said, "but we're not wealthy enough for me to have a tutor. I finished my schooling 4 years ago." Jo frowned. "How old are you?" 11. "That's what I thought, same as me. How old were you when you started then?" 5. "So you had 2 years at school?" "That's normal, isn't it?" she said. "I can read well enough and write a little, and I do the household accounts with my mother, so I know how to manage money. What would be the point of going to school to learn Latin and Greek like Peter?" Jo had to agree with her. It was hard to see what earthly use there was in what Peter was doing this afternoon. "Next year," Lucy went on, "I'm going to start doing my father's accounts with him. My mother does them at the moment, but they both want me to learn. That seems much more useful." Jo nodded. They walked on together. Around them the street was just as loud as it had been earlier. "What's that crashing?" Jo asked. "That's from the foundries in Lothbury," Lucy said. "It's only a couple of streets from here." "And that shrill noise?" "Oh, that's the dung cart. The rakers and scavengers have been through already to collect the general rubbish." She pointed to the baskets Jo had noticed outside the houses earlier on. "But they're still doing the rounds with the dung pots." "They're collecting poo?" Jo asked, horrified. From everyone who doesn't have a house of office or a privy in the garden. They come every day except Sundays. What do they do with it? Lucy thought for a minute. You know, I'm not sure. I know the rubbish is taken out and left on the roadside beyond the city gates for empty carts to take on their way back to the country. Lucky them. Lucy shrugged. I guess the poo ends up on the fields, maybe, though some of it definitely ends up in the river. Jo pulled a face. So is that the awful smell? The dung cart? No, I don't think so. There's a tannery on the next street, so there's a bit of a smell of wee and dog poo coming from there. She sniffed, but mostly it's coming from that churchyard. Jo looked where she gestured. It occurred to him now that he'd passed a huge number of churches with William earlier, more churches than he'd ever seen in one town in his own world. Now he thought about it, this smell had been in the air most of the time, but especially when they passed a churchyard. What is it, though? He asked. Lucy's brows furrowed. Bodies, of course, she said. I thought you said lots of people were dying in Norwich. They are. Well then, that's what you get when the graveyards are piled high. They've covered the bodies with lime to make them rot down quicker, but it takes a while. Jo didn't know what to say. Suddenly he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. He snatched at Lucy's sleeve. What is that? On the ground in front of them, a trickle of dark liquid had seeped out beneath the gate. It ran between the cobbles like a stream flowing around rocks. It looks like blood to me, Lucy said calmly. Just at that moment there was a hideous scream from the yard behind the gates. The hairs stood up on Jo's neck. What is it, Lucy? He clutched her arm. What's happening in there? Someone is killing someone. Are they? We'll see tomorrow. So I guess you get a bit of a picture of London. This is what I imagine London was like, and I have checked it with people who know better than me, so that there's nothing in there that's actually not right. I don't know. Can you imagine it? The smell, I think that's the worst of it. Tanneries. They used to use dog poo for tanning leather and wee. And then the bodies. The bodies. You know how graveyards around small churches sometimes in the country are quite high up, and that's because over time bodies end up buried on top of other bodies. So there we are. Okay, well tomorrow I will be back at 5:30, not 5 o'clock, as I mentioned at the beginning, just to make sure I have enough time for my appointment in town. And other than that, I hope you have a pleasant evening. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.